If you're interested in learning how to do experimentation with an Optimizely feature experimentation, then this is a video you don't want to miss out on. In this video, I'm going to cover all the advanced topics available with an Optimizely feature experimentation, including staged and progressive rollouts, experimentation, as well as personalization. This video is covering it all. It's going to be a banger. So, before we start, I need to point out that this is actually episode 2 in a very small mini-series that I've created on Optimizely feature experimentation. Now, in the first video, and the link to that video is below, then you'll learn how to create a feature flag and how the architecture of Optimizely FX works. So this video is going to build upon those learnings. So if I cover anything in this video that doesn't make sense, go back and watch the previous video first. Now, with that all said and done, let's think about what we can do with Optimizely FX. The first thing to point out is that any feature flag that you create inside of Optimizely FX can be converted to an experiment easily. And the reason for this is because they're the same thing. Now on the screen you can see Optimizely FX. I've created a flag, and then in here you can see that I can click on this add rule button right here. Now click on this, you can see that I can add in a targeted delivery, an A/B test, or a multi-arm bandit test. And all of these can be created inside of a single flag. And this is a very big differentiator in Optimizely FX compared to some of the other tools. Now, when it comes to setting up an experiment with FX, you're going to have to consider your hypothesis. What do you actually want to test? And let's take this as an example. So you can see here that I've got a banner. Now, if I wanted to do an experiment on this banner, some of the things I might want to test might include the background color. I might want to test the headline here. I might want to test this button and where it clicks to. And basically, anything you identify throughout that process will need to be converted into a variable within Optimizely FX. And within FX itself, you can create variables in this flag setup column. You can see the first line here is variables. Clicking on this will get you to this screen, and then creating a new variable is done by clicking on this button, and FX itself will allow you to create Boolean strings, integers, doubles, or if you need to model more complicated things, JSON. So let's create a string. You can see that we can give it a variable key, and potentially we'll need to access this in our code. So this naming is important. Then we can give it a default value. So this is going to be the value that will be used before we start doing experimentation with it. And then underneath, you can see that Optimizely is also going to give you the code snippet. So you can copy and paste this into your code base, and it could be filtered to any one of the SDKs that you're using. So that's really handy. So now let's take this example we looked at previously and think about how we can model it in Optimizely. Now, for this particular example, I've decided to split this thing into 4 different variables. So we've got background color, we've got button underscore text, button underscore URL, and component title. And the first thing that I want to point out here is that there's no way of validating or making sure that you use consistent naming. Now remember that all of these keys are going to eventually map to code. And you can see here that we've got background color and there's no underscore. And you can see that we've got button underscore text. So it's going to be up to you to make sure that you use a consistent naming convention when you're setting up your variable keys. And forgetting to do this is basically going to mean you're going to have some funky looking code. So this is important. Now that we've got our variables created and Optimizely give you the code to copy to your code base, let's actually look at a working example and see how I implemented this flag. So first off, you're going to do something like a decide, and this is where you pass in your flag name. So remember, this then maps to this property here. So this is the name of your flag. Then we've got access to an object, and from here you've got access to variables, and then from here you can access each variable using its key. So remember here we've got our background color key variable. You can see that this is the key name, and then this relates to the key name here. Then we've got, our component title, which is component underscore title. You can see that this maps to this one. Then after I've got access to my variables, you can use it to render your feature or do whatever makes you happy. With those variables set up within your code base, you're now ready to create your first experiment. Now, when it comes to creating an experiment, you're going to be comparing multiple different variations, or in essence, multiple different types of configuration to see which configuration is the best. And this is the reason why, as well as having variables, we also need the ability to create variations. And you can create variations within FX, again within the flag setup tab. Underneath, you can see we have this variations options. Clicking on that, you can see that we've got a bunch of variations that I've already created, and creating a brand new variation, very similar to how we created a variable. At the top, there's a big create new variation button. Clicking on this is then going to launch the configure variation wizard. So hopefully you can see that the configure variation wizard here is basically going to be composed of fields based on what you set up within the variable section on your flag. So for each variation, you can give it a name. And again, this is going to automatically generate a key for you. However, the key bit here is within this variable section. So every single variable that you created in your flag is going to appear here. And you can see that if you use any default values, these are automatically going to be pulled through. Now, clicking on any of the variables, you can see that I can overwrite any single value I want. So anything that I want to overwrite, I can just give it a new value, and then when I save my variation, you can see that it's there, and I can then use it for my experiments or for feature flagging or whatever will make me happy. With our variations defined, we're now ready to set up the basics of an A/B test. And we do that again within the environment screen. So clicking on this, you can see in the top here, we've got this add rule button. Clicking on this, we can create a targeted delivery, an A/B test, or a multi-arm bandit test. And for this example, let's just stick with the basics, so an A/B test. Now, setting up a test, we can give it a name. And if I'm honest, the name of this test is less important because you won't really be using or accessing this key in code. Now, we've got a few options which we'll come back to in a minute. However, when it comes to an A/B test, we want to basically set up some variations. You can see here that variation 1, clicking on this drop down, I can pick from my variations that we created a minute ago. So variation 1 can map to banner 1, variation 2 can map to a banner 2, and then you can see here that there's a little plus button. Clicking on this will allow me to create another variation. So now variation 3 can map to banner 3. And this is the basics of how we can create an experiment and compare different variables and variations. So we create our variable, then we create a variation, then we create an A/B test, and then we add and map our variations to variations, and job is a good one. So variations will allow us to compare two different things. However, how do we actually track if our experiment is successful or not? And this is where events and metrics come into the equation. So we're still in our A/B test, and you can see above our variations, we've got the ability to choose metrics. Now, metrics here, I've set up a few. You can see we've got blog post click, banner click, button click, all that kind of good stuff. Now, when it comes to adding a metric, you can either define success as an increase or a decrease, and you can also configure things like unique conversions, total revenue, total value. And you can see here that when we're adding a metric, we're also going to get all the code. So just filter by the SDK that you want to use, and you can see that we can then copy and paste this into our source code. So granted, that metric screen covered quite a lot, and there's probably a few bits there that you still don't understand. Now, metrics in itself is probably a bigger topic than I can cover in this video. However, it's probably worth pointing out I have created a blog which is metrics within Optimizely Web explained for the normal people. So this also applies to full stack because it uses the same events underneath. So if you want to learn a bit more, I recommend you read this article. And it's definitely also worth pointing out that you can also create events from the main tab here. So click on it, click on the big button here, and you're going to get a screen very similar to the other one. So you can give things a name, a key, and you'll get access to the sample code, which you can filter again. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking, brilliant, I don't want to create events in code because I already have my events in a third party like Google Analytics, a CDP, analytics platform, custom database, whatever. And this is the reason why Optimizely also has the event API. So the event API will allow you to send either a single event or a batch full of events. So if you really want to, you can send things and create things from external third parties. Now, the only real important thing to note here is that when you're sending events using the API, if the event doesn't exist here, then the API will ignore it. So a really important tip is make sure that you create the event in Optimizely first before you actually send any data into it. With variables, variations, events, and metrics covered, you know most of the basics of setting up an experiment in FX. However, there's still a few key settings that we haven't covered. So let's do that now. So in our settings, obviously we've covered name and key. The next thing to point out is audiences. So audiences, personalization, segments, however you prefer to call it, this is how you can decide who's going to be added or bucketed into your experiment. So, after you launch the experiment in FX, as soon as a user sees that feature, they're going to be automatically added into that experiment, and depending on how you set up the rules, they're going to be associated to a variation. Now, sometimes you might not want to show that experiment to everyone, and this is where audiences, personalization segments come in. So this feature will allow you to create specific rules on who you target to add into that experiment. Now, we'll cover this very shortly because there's a lot to cover around here. Directly under audiences, we have another traffic allocation feature, ramp percentage, and this is basically a traffic throttler. So by default, the ramp percentage will be 100%, which means that everyone who sees the feature will be added into it. But let's say that you want to launch a new feature and you're not sure if it works yet. So actually all you want to do is launch it to 14% of your audience, test it, validate it works, and when you're happy, you can ramp it up to 100. This is what ramp features for, and the good news is that you can change the traffic allocation here, and it's not going to affect the results of your experiment. So this is more purely a feature flagging tool to make sure that you're releasing things without impacting user experience. Now, we've covered metrics, and then the next thing we need to cover is the distribution mode. So you can see here we have two options. So the first option is manual. And when we have a manual distribution mode, it's basically up to you to decide the traffic allocation of when someone gets added into an experiment of which variation split they're going to see. So you can see here that we can change things. So it might be 33, 33, and 33. And for most of the time, if you're using manual, you're just going to leave this as is. Now, the benefit of Optimize the FX is that it also has another mode called Stats Accelerator. And Stats Accelerator basically uses AI to figure out how to run and control the experiment in order for you to get statistical significance a lot quicker. So how Stats Accelerator mode works is pretty simple. In the background, the algorithm is going to monitor your experiments, and if it sees that one of your variations is more likely to hit statistical significance, then it's going to slowly drive more traffic to it. And this is the reason in this example you can see that variation 1 here is actually got 33% of the traffic, where variation 2 and variation 3 have both got 29, because obviously more people are clicking through and using this banner, and it looks like it's more successful compared to the other ones. And this is a key differentiator when it comes to experimentation, because being able to get to statistical significance quicker is basically going to make you more money, and it's going to allow you to hit your KPIs quicker. And all the maths, all the data, everything around this is really simple. The more experiments you can run, the faster you can run them, the more money you'll make, the better you're going to do. So Stats Accelerator, there's no downside for using it. Simply drop down to Stats Accelerator mode, use 3 variations, and off you go. You're going to get a better return of investment. The second to last setting to cover is the allow list down here, and this is really handy for testing and integration tests, because what it will do is allow you to map a particular user ID to a certain variation. So this means that you can test every single permutation of a feature or experiment without having to mess around too much. And then the final feature to cover is the exclusion groups, and this is all around data cross-contamination. So let's say that you're running 2 experiments on a page and you don't want someone to be added into both experiments. Well, one way you could use the audiences. However, an easier way is potentially to use exclusion groups. So this basically says that if you're added into this experiment, you're not allowed to be added into this other experiment. So that covers the main experiment settings you'll have access to. The final thing to cover is the difference between an A/B test and a multi-arm bandit test. So let's say that I click on a multi-arm bandit. You can see that all the properties in the right-hand side here, they're very similar to the A/B test. The only difference really is that we don't have the distribution mode and there's no Stats Accelerator. Now on a multi-arm bandit, you can see here that the traffic allocation is grayed out, meaning that Optimizely controls traffic allocation for you. And this is the key difference with multi-arm bandits. So the best way I like to explain this is thinking about being on a Black Friday sale on an e-commerce website. Now, just like a Google ad network, sometimes you just want to display the best variation and you don't care about long-term learnings. So Black Friday, let's say you have a load of marketing material all aimed for Black Friday 2023, and as soon as Black Friday's finished, you don't really care about understanding statistical significance. All you want to do is improve sales for that 1 week. And this is why you use multi-arm bandits. So multi-arm bandits, just like the Google Ad Network knows how to show the best ad, it will display the best variation in real time for you. So you're not working towards statistical significance. The algorithm is just going to say this one is being clicked on or whatever it might be in real time. So I'm going to display this more often compared to the other variations. And the research and data super clear on this topic. Use multi-arm bandits for fixed point in time campaigns and you will improve conversion. The final topic that I want to cover in this video is personalization, because any feature flag or experiment that you set up with Optimizely, you can also add personalization to it. So personalization, audiences, segments, whatever you want to call it. This is the ability to define a group and then only showing that feature experiment to that certain subset of people. So to get going with personalization within feature experimentation, you're going to be working within the audiences tab, which you'll find right here. Now, within feature experimentation, there's basically two different types of audiences that you can use. Now, the easiest one is to pass audience data or personalization data at code level. And it's also possible to import segments from third-party tools. However, this does affect the price. We're going to start off by looking at the code first way. So the first thing you want to do is go to this little tab here, which is called attributes. And anything that you want to create a personalization group on, you'll need to create an attribute. So some common examples might be a cookie value, device type, could be if someone's logged in. So all you do is click on the create button at the top, give it a name, off you go. So the important thing to note here is that the name or the key of your attribute is going to relate to some code that you're going to need to write. So if we jump back to our code, you can see here that where I'm actually doing the user context, I'm passing in a user ID, and you can see here that I'm passing in different attributes. So we've got an attribute called location and one which is called device type. And it'll be up to you to provide the data for these attributes. So location here maps to something called location here. You can see that device type here maps to device type here. Now that we have our attributes set up and defined in code and in Optimizely, a non-technical person can now create an audience or personalization group. So they do that from the Save tab, clicking on Create New Audience. So on the right-hand side here, you can see that all the attributes you defined appears, and then someone can just simply grab this recipe, drag it to the left-hand side here, and you can say things like, if a visitor matches or does not match, does it have a value? Is it a string? Has it got a Boolean? Is it false? Is it true? Is it a version number? All that kind of good stuff. Now, these personalization groups can be simple, or you can combine them, so you can add in multiple different things, and you can see that you can build up very complicated personalization groups as you go along. Now, once you're happy, you give your personalization group a name. So let's say target everyone, and then you click save. So you can see some of the groups I've got are things like American users, Android users, English users, iOS users, members, non-members. Now, if we go back to our A/B test, what you'll see is that when we go back to that audiences tab, I've now got the ability to pick from those audiences that we've created. So you can see English users, American users. It's even possible to create an audience here. However, I prefer doing it from this tab. So that covers the first part of how you can create personalization groups and segments within Optimizely at the code level. Now, it's also possible to import segments from third-party tools, and we'll look at that next. We're back inside the audience builder, and you can see that in this attributes drop-down, all the attributes we created, they exist here. Now, underneath it, we've also got advanced audience targeting. And if I open up this, you can see we have these two recipes. So we have custom segments and pre-built segments. So if I drag my custom segments recipe across here, you can see that we've got this custom segment drop down. And if I click on it, you can see that I'm getting a load of personalization groups, which are being pulled in from Optimizely CDP, which is called ODP. So even though I'm using ODP, the key takeaway is that you can import segments from third-party tools. Now, Optimizely also has a bunch of other connectors. This includes mParticle, ZeroTap, helium, and segments. There's a bunch of other ones. So if you need to import data from third parties, it's definitely possible using this mechanism. And that covers everything you need to know in order to do experimentation and advanced feature flagging with Optimizely feature experimentation. Now, before we part ways, if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel. Now, if you haven't come across me before, my name is John and I've been working with Optimizely products for about 20 odd years now. So every Sunday I release a new video on programming, developer tools, productivity, feature flagging, all that kind of good stuff. So if that floats your boat, you know what to do. And also, if you want to see the first part of this video, how to set up a basic feature flag with Optimizely feature experimentation, the link to the video is on the screen right now. Click on that. Otherwise, have a great day. Happy coding.